September 1943, Camp Croft, South Carolina. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the guard tower as Corporal Giuseppe Verelli stared at the American lieutenant standing before him. The officer was holding his battered violin case, extending it toward him with a gesture that defied every expectation of captivity. "We understand you were concertmaster with the Turin Philharmonic before the war," the lieutenant said, his Italian pronunciation imperfect but comprehensible. "We're organizing a concert next week for the camp. Would you consider performing?" For a musician who had expected to spend his captivity breaking rocks or harvesting cotton, the invitation created a cognitive dissonance so profound that Verelli later described it as the moment when everything I understood about being a prisoner of war collapsed. The violin case represented an impossibility made tangible, not punishment, but performance, not deprivation, but creation. Across American prison camps that autumn, 51,483 Italian POWs confronted a reality that contradicted everything fascist propaganda had taught them about American cultural barbarism. They discovered a nation that valued classical music enough to place instruments in the hands of enemy combatants, that organized concerts while fighting a global war, that saw musicians as artists first and prisoners second. This musical transformation, recorded in military documents, personal correspondences, and post-war interviews, would systematically dismantle Italian cultural superiority myths more effectively than any re-education program. The mathematics of cultural exchange were being written in musical notation and performance schedules, revealing an American approach to art that rendered Italian fascism's cultural control not patriotic necessity, but destructive limitation. What began as bewilderment at American musical freedom would evolve into complete ideological transformation. Operation Avalanche. The Allied invasion of mainland Italy in September 1943 coincided with the Italian armistice, creating military chaos that brought thousands of Italian soldiers into American custody. With Mussolini deposed and Italy's new government declaring war on Germany, these men occupied an unprecedented position, technically co-belligerents rather than enemies, yet still held as prisoners. Military records show that among the 51,483 Italian POWs transported to the United States, approximately 1,800 had professional or semi-professional musical training. Italy's military bands, disbanded during surrender, had contained classically trained musicians conscripted from the nation's conservatories and orchestras. The Turin Radio Orchestra alone had lost 28 members to military service. The Rome Opera, 43. La Scala in Milan, 37. These musicians arrived in America carrying memories of instruments rather than the instruments themselves. Standard prisoner processing included forms documenting civilian occupations. American camp commanders, facing the monotony of prison administration, recognized an unexpected resource in these musical professionals. Rather than viewing them as security threats, they identified cultural assets. At Camp Croft, where Giuseppe Verelli encountered his violin again, the commandant had requisitioned 12 violins, 3 violas, 2 cellos, 1 bass, 8 woodwinds, 6 brass instruments, and 1 piano through the YMCA War Prisoners Aid Program. Similar acquisitions occurred at Fort Meade, Maryland, Camp Florence, Arizona, and Camp Shelby, Mississippi. These instruments, standard professional quality rather than student models, represented an investment in cultural rehabilitation that fascist Italy had abandoned during wartime austerity. The first performances were tentative affairs. At Camp Croft, Verelli led 7 musicians through Vivaldi's Spring Concerto, performed in the mess hall for 200 fellow prisoners and 15 American guards. Military records document the date, October 17, 1943, and note that the performance received enthusiastic reception from prisoners and guards alike. What began as an experiment in alleviating boredom revealed unexpected power. POWs accustomed to strict separation between captors and captives witnessed something remarkable, American officers and Italian prisoners applauding the same music, experiencing the same emotions, recognizing the same beauty. The shared cultural vocabulary of Western classical music created a space where enemies became simply musicians and listeners. By November 1943, the Camp Croft ensemble had expanded to 23 players. Their repertoire, documented in concert programs preserved in military archives, included Rossini overtures, Mozart symphonies, and most remarkably, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. American music that had been unavailable in fascist Italy due to cultural restrictions against degenerate jazz influences. When news of Allied victories in Italy reached Camp Croft, the Italian musicians experienced the war's surreal contradiction. They watched as Americans celebrated battlefield successes against their former German allies, victories that were liberating their homeland while simultaneously confirming their nation's military defeat. Some refused to perform during these celebrations. Others played with unexpected enthusiasm. Giuseppe Verelli described this contradiction in a letter, partially redacted by military censors but preserved in archives. "Today, we played Puccini, while the Americans celebrated taking Naples." The captain asked specifically for Italian music for their victory party. "I found myself playing for the defeat of people I once considered comrades and the victory of those who imprisoned me." Yet somehow, the music made both possible simultaneously. The paradox of imprisonment was becoming clear. These musicians enjoyed creative freedoms behind barbed wire that exceeded what they had experienced as free citizens under fascism. They could perform American music, jazz-influenced compositions, modernist pieces banned under Mussolini's cultural restrictions. The prison camps were becoming conservatories of democratic expression. By December 1943, the phenomenon had spread nationwide. Military records document 37 formal musical ensembles in American POW camps housing Italians. From chamber groups to full orchestras, from traditional Italian folk ensembles to experimental jazz combos, these prisoners were discovering musical freedom while physically confined. The wire fences contained their bodies, but American cultural policy had somehow liberated their artistic expression. This contradiction would transform them from enemy combatants to unlikely cultural ambassadors. January 1944, Fort Custer, Michigan. The Liberty ship SS John C. Breckinridge docked at Newport News, Virginia, completing a 14-day Atlantic crossing that transported 1,527 Italian prisoners to American soil. Among them stood Maestro Paolo Fabbri, former conductor of the Florence Municipal Orchestra, clutching a worn leather briefcase containing his only remaining possession of value, hand-copied scores of Verdi and Puccini arias. As the prisoners disembarked into the bitter Virginia winter, American processing officers made an unexpected inquiry. Musicians stepped forward. 27 men, including Fabbri, identified themselves. Rather than being assigned to standard work details, they were segregated for special classification, not as security threats, but as cultural resources. The Army's prisoner processing forms included occupation codes for musicians, a categorization that would determine their entire captivity experience. Form WD-PMG-2 listed 7 distinct musical classifications: conductor, string instrumentalist, brass player, woodwind player, pianist, percussionist, vocalist. Military efficiency, typically focused on extracting labor value from prisoners, had created a taxonomy of artistic talent. The railway journey from Virginia to Michigan introduced Italian musicians to American abundance. Unlike the cattle cars used for prisoner transport in Europe, these men traveled in standard passenger coaches with dining service. American railway porters, themselves classically trained musicians in civilian life, engaged the prisoners in conversations about Puccini and Verdi. One porter, a graduate of the Juilliard School, played Negro spirituals on his violin during a stop in Cincinnati, music that had never reached Italian conservatories under fascist cultural restrictions. At Fort Custer, Paolo Fabbri encountered a reality that contradicted everything fascist propaganda had prepared him for: an American military base with its own dedicated music hall. The facility, built for performances by American military bands, contained a stage, proper acoustics, seating for 300, and most remarkably, a temperature-controlled instrument storage room. The base commander, Colonel William Preston, himself an amateur cellist, had requisitioned musical instruments for the camp through both military channels and civilian donations. The inventory, documented in quartermaster records, represented an investment in cultural activity that exceeded what many Italian municipal orchestras had possessed before the war: 12 violins, including 2 Guarneri models valued at $100 to $200 each, 4 violas, 3 cellos, 2 double basses, complete woodwind and brass sections, percussion including timpani, and a recently tuned Baldwin grand piano. Total estimated value, $27,450, at a time when the average American annual income was $2,600. The formation of the Fort Custer POW Orchestra occurred with American organizational efficiency. Auditions were held February 12–14, 1944, overseen jointly by the camp's Special Services Officer and Professor Leonard McWilliams from nearby Western Michigan College's music department. The results created a professional ensemble of 43 musicians drawn from 6 different POW compounds. Military transportation was arranged to bring players together for rehearsals 3 times weekly. Printed programs identified performers by name and civilian credentials rather than prisoner numbers. American sheet music distributors supplied materials that had been unavailable in wartime Italy. The camp library contained complete orchestral scores for standard repertoire from Bach to Debussy. Most remarkably, it included contemporary American composers: Copland, Barber, Gershwin, Ellington, works banned under fascist cultural policies as degenerate or negroid. Military records show regular orders for additional scores, approved without hesitation. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, similar developments had produced the Melody Makers, a 29-piece orchestra specializing in American swing music. The ensemble's leader, Sergeant Antonio Pascucci, formerly trumpeter with Radio Roma's staff orchestra, had never played jazz before imprisonment. Now he was performing Glenn Miller arrangements with musicians who had once accompanied Mussolini's speeches. The camp commander had provided not only instruments, but professional quality Shure microphones, a Magni-Aux amplification system, and RCA recording equipment, technology superior to what Radio Roma had possessed. Across the American POW system, musical groups flourished with surprising diversity. Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia, housed a traditional Italian folk ensemble using instruments crafted by prisoners in the camp woodshop. Fort Meade, Maryland, supported a classical chamber quartet performing Vivaldi and Mozart. Camp Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, featured a 12-piece jazz combo specializing in what they called Italian swing, traditional Neapolitan songs arranged with American jazz harmonies. The paradox was undeniable. Enemy prisoners enjoyed musical resources exceeding what they had known as free citizens. Their compatriots in Italy faced instrument shortages, performance restrictions, and ideological censorship of repertoire. Meanwhile, these imprisoned musicians received new strings when needed, unlimited practice time, dedicated performance spaces, and complete artistic freedom in programming. This contradiction created powerful psychological impact, documented in censored letters home. Pianist Giacomo Vittorini wrote to his family in Naples, "My hands touch a better piano in prison than I ever played in freedom. The Americans value music so much that they provide me with everything I need to perform, despite being their enemy. I play what I choose, not what the state demands." By mid-1944, formal concerts had become standard features of camp life. Military records document 173 performances across the POW system between January and June 1944. Programs ranged from traditional Italian opera excerpts to Beethoven symphonies to American jazz standards. Audiences comprised fellow prisoners, American guards, and increasingly invited civilians from surrounding communities. The prison orchestras were evolving from recreational activities into cultural institutions. What began as a pragmatic effort to occupy prisoners' time was revealing deeper significance. The music making itself demonstrated American cultural values: individual expression, artistic freedom, multiculturalism, and pragmatic resource allocation, all contradicting fascist principles of cultural purity and state control. Without explicit propaganda, these performance opportunities were systematically dismantling the ideological foundations of Italian fascism more effectively than any re-education lecture. The POW musicians, still technically enemies, were experiencing a form of American democracy through musical organization. They elected section leaders, voted on repertoire, and negotiated rehearsal schedules, exercises in self-governance that had been impossible under fascist cultural institutions. The orchestra structure itself, with its balance between individual expression and collective harmony, became a living model of democratic principles in action. March 1944. Stillwater, Oklahoma. The auditorium of Stillwater High School was filled to capacity. 732 local citizens seated shoulder to shoulder, programs rustling in hand. On stage, beneath the American flag, stood 37 Italian prisoners of war in their olive-drab uniforms with PW stenciled across the backs. As the conductor raised his baton, tension filled the room. These men had been enemies just months ago. Now they were about to perform American patriotic music for the families of servicemen still fighting in Europe. The decision to allow enemy prisoners to perform beyond camp boundaries represented a remarkable shift in policy. Military documents reveal the debate within War Department leadership. Security concerns competed with propaganda opportunities and humanitarian considerations. Major General Archer Lersch, Provost Marshal General responsible for all POW operations, approved the first public performance with a handwritten note. Music may build bridges where words cannot. Approved with appropriate security measures. Initial civilian reactions ranged from outright hostility to cautious curiosity. The Stillwater News Press published letters both condemning the performance as coddling the enemy and supporting it as demonstrating American values. Religious leaders proved particularly supportive. Reverend William McFarland of First Baptist Church Stillwater told his congregation, "By showing kindness to our enemies, we demonstrate the very values our boys are fighting for overseas." The first public concert program, preserved in Oklahoma Historical Society archives, reveals careful diplomatic balancing. The Star-Spangled Banner required opening, Verdi's Nabucco Overture, American folk songs arranged by Copland, Puccini arias, and Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. This musical diplomacy, honoring both American and Italian traditions while avoiding politically charged pieces, created cultural common ground where political agreement was impossible. Newspaper coverage documented public response. The Stillwater News Press headline read, "Enemy musicians win hearts through universal language of music." The article noted, many audience members arrived skeptical and departed moved. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, whose son is currently serving in Italy with the Fifth Army, commented, "I came prepared to hate them, but their music reminded me these are human beings, not faceless enemies." Financial records reveal another surprising dimension. These performances generated significant funds for American war efforts. The Stillwater concert collected $2,117 in ticket sales and donations, equivalent to approximately $32,000 in today's currency. Every dollar went to war bond purchases. The irony was inescapable. Italian prisoners were now financially supporting American military operations against their former German allies. This pattern repeated across America as the POW performance program expanded. Camp McCain Orchestra from Mississippi performed at Jackson City Auditorium, generating $3,142 in war bond sales. Fort Custer's ensemble played Detroit's Orchestra Hall, raising $7,315. By December 1944, POW musicians had generated over $274,000 for American war bonds, enemy soldiers literally financing the American war effort. Local radio stations began broadcasting these concerts, extending their impact beyond immediate audiences. KOCY Oklahoma City aired the Camp Gruber Italian Orchestra weekly on Sunday afternoons. Program logs show a regular listenership exceeding 40,000. WMAQ Chicago featured the Fort Sheridan Chamber Ensemble monthly, reaching an estimated 120,000 listeners. These broadcasts normalized Italian prisoners as cultural contributors rather than enemies, humanizing them for American audiences who would never see them in person. The performances created cognitive dissonance for all involved. American audiences confronted the humanity of men they had been conditioned to view as enemies. Italian musicians experienced the contradiction of supporting America's war effort while remaining prisoners. This mutual disorientation proved fertile ground for changing perspectives. Letters Home, heavily censored but preserved in military archives, reveal the musicians' conflicted emotions. Tenor Roberto Longo wrote to his family in Milan, "Today I sang 'God Bless America' before 500 people who applauded with tears in their eyes. Yesterday these people were my enemies. Today they stand for the music. I do not understand this contradiction, but I feel something important changing within me." Newspaper editorials began acknowledging the transformative potential of these cultural exchanges. The Chicago Tribune, initially critical of public POW performances, published a remarkable reversal on July 4, 1944. The Italian musicians at Fort Sheridan demonstrate that cultural appreciation transcends national boundaries. While our nations were divided by war, we remain united by Verdi, Puccini, and the universal language of music. Perhaps herein lies a foundation for future peace. The War Department recognized unexpected propaganda value in these performances. Foreign broadcast transcripts were sent to Italian territories, describing former Italian soldiers performing freely in America while enjoying excellent treatment. These broadcasts directly contradicted Nazi propaganda, claiming American mistreatment of Italian POWs, providing powerful counter-narratives in the ongoing information war. By summer 1944, as Allied forces liberated Rome, Italian POW musicians in America found themselves in a surreal position, performing concerts celebrating Allied victories that were simultaneously liberating their homeland and confirming their nation's defeat. This contradiction required psychological reconciliation, possible only through artistic expression. A particularly powerful moment occurred when the Fort Custer Orchestra performed a benefit concert the day Rome was liberated. The program included Respighi's Pines of Rome, an explicit musical celebration of the Italian capital. American audience members reported being moved to tears watching Italian musicians perform this tribute to their home city on the day of its liberation by American forces. Cultural appreciation had created space for mutual understanding impossible in political terms. As Italian POWs toured beyond camps, they encountered an America that contradicted fascist propaganda. They performed in high school auditoriums where music education was standard curriculum, not elite privilege. They played concert halls in small farming towns, demonstrating cultural appreciation beyond metropolitan centers. They encountered African American musicians who, despite facing segregation, possessed world-class talent undeveloped in Italy due to racial theories limiting cultural exchange. These experiences, documented in post-war interviews, reveal profound realization. These musicians, once proud cultural representatives of fascist Italy, were discovering they had been participating not in cultural superiority, but in cultural imprisonment. The military defeat of Italy now represented not just national humiliation, but opportunity for artistic liberation. What began as enemy status was transforming into cultural ambassadorship, using music to build understanding that political language could not achieve. August 1944, New Orleans, Louisiana. The trumpet sounded a blue note, bending pitch in a way no European conservatory taught. Behind the Camp Algiers fence, Sergeant Marco Bianchi hesitated, then attempted to replicate the sound, his classically trained embouchure struggling with this foreign technique. His teacher, Private First Class William "Sweet Willie" Johnson, a black American guard who had played with King Oliver's Creole jazz band before the war, demonstrated again. "Feel it, don't think it," Johnson explained, demonstrating the half-valve technique that gave jazz its characteristic vocal quality. This informal lesson, occurring during off-duty hours, exemplified the musical democracy that Italian POWs encountered in America, a stark contrast to fascist Italy's rigid cultural hierarchies. Under Mussolini's regime, jazz had been officially denounced as Negro music, incompatible with Italian racial purity. Government directives from 1937 had limited hot music on radio broadcasts to less than 7% of programming. By 1940, jazz performances required special permits, and American recordings were confiscated from music stores. The Ministry of Popular Culture had established the Commission for Italian Music, which certified compositions as sufficiently Italian in character. In American prison camps, these musicians encountered precisely the opposite: cultural freedom that valued artistic expression above political ideology. At Camp Algiers, the Special Services Officer had assembled a record collection of 78 RPM discs documenting American musical evolution, field recordings of rural blues, early jazz from New Orleans, swing from Chicago and New York, bebop's emerging complexities. These recordings, unavailable in Italy even before wartime restrictions, represented an education in musical possibilities beyond European classical traditions. The musicians' astonishment at American musical diversity appears repeatedly in their letters. Pianist Giovanni Rossi wrote home, "Here I have heard Negro spirituals with harmonies that would make Debussy envious. I have studied jazz records where musicians improvise with mathematical complexity while maintaining soulful expression. This music, officially described as primitive by our cultural authorities, contains sophistication our conservatories never acknowledged." At Fort Lawton, Washington, Italian prisoners attended performances by the post's integrated band, witnessing black and white musicians performing together, a collaboration forbidden in fascist Italy and complicated even in segregated America. The military, though still officially segregated, created performance spaces where musical merit temporarily transcended racial boundaries. These integrated performances, occurring within military contexts before civilian society achieved similar integration, demonstrated democracy's cultural potential to Italian observers. Women's musical leadership provided another challenge to Italian cultural norms. At Camp Florence, Arizona, the Special Services Officer arranged for the Phoenix Ladies Orchestra to perform for prisoners. The 27-member all-female ensemble, directed by Katherine Johnson Ballard, performed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and Gershwin's American in Paris with technical proficiency that contradicted Italian gender assumptions. Prisoner Federico Bertolucci, former violist with Rome Radio Orchestra, noted in his diary, "Today, I witnessed women performing complex orchestral works with precision equal to any male ensemble. This contradicts everything we were taught about female capabilities in serious music." The American enthusiasm for amateur music making further challenged elitist European traditions. When the Camp McCain Orchestra performed at Mississippi State College, they encountered the college's 120-member band comprised mostly of agriculture and engineering students. This democratic approach to music education, technical training alongside artistic development, contradicted Italian systems that segregated vocational and artistic education. Throughout 1944, Italian POW musicians increasingly encountered Black American musical traditions previously inaccessible under fascism. Military records document visits by the Deep River Boys to Camp Crossville, Tennessee, and performances by Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis's all-black 477th Bombardment Group Band at Fort Custer, Michigan. These experiences directly contradicted fascist racial theories about cultural capabilities. The musicians' letters reflect profound reconsiderations of propaganda they had previously accepted. Violinist Antonio Ferrara wrote, "I was taught that jazz represented American cultural degeneracy. Now I recognize it as America's greatest artistic contribution, a musical democracy where individual expression and collective harmony coexist, where European traditions merge with African rhythms to create something entirely new." This musical re-education extended beyond stylistic preferences to core ideological beliefs. The democratic nature of American musical culture, its pluralism, innovation, and accessibility, directly challenge fascist principles of cultural purity, state control, and hierarchical value. Without explicit propaganda, musical experiences were systematically dismantling the ideological foundations these prisoners had been raised to accept. At Camp Custer's July 1944 performance, documented in Michigan Historical Archives, the program included Aaron Copland's Lincoln Portrait, narrated by a black serviceman reading Lincoln's words about equality while Italian musicians performed the score. This juxtaposition, enemies of America performing patriotic music celebrating freedom, accompanied by a black American enjoying liberties still denied in much of the nation, created powerful cognitive dissonance for all involved. For Italian musicians accustomed to state censorship, American musical freedom seemed almost anarchic. Concert programs required no government approval. Repertoire selections reflected artistic rather than political considerations. Critical reviews in newspapers expressed honest opinions rather than party doctrine. This environment allowed prisoners to reconnect with music's fundamental purpose, human expression rather than nationalist propaganda. The impact extended beyond aesthetics to professional practice. Italian conductors observed American rehearsal techniques, emphasizing efficiency and democratic input rather than authoritarian control. Orchestra members voted on repertoire selections. Section leaders rotated to develop multiple musicians' leadership skills. These practical demonstrations of democratic principles proved more persuasive than any lecture on political theory. By fall 1944, military records document 215 Italian POW musical ensembles operating across the American camp system. Their repertoire had expanded dramatically from initial focus on Italian classics to embrace American folk music, jazz, swing, Broadway standards, and contemporary classical works. This musical evolution paralleled ideological transformation, from cultural nationalism to aesthetic pluralism. The democratization of musical experience extended to audience development. Performances increasingly included educational components, pre-concert talks explaining musical traditions, program notes providing historical context, even instrument demonstrations for local school children. These Italian musicians, once cultural representatives of fascism, were becoming ambassadors for a different vision. Music as a universal language transcending national boundaries. As 1944 ended, these prisoners found themselves not just performing music, but participating in a profound cultural exchange. They taught Americans appreciation for Italian operatic traditions while learning American jazz techniques. They shared folk melodies from Italian villages while absorbing spirituals born in American slavery. What Mussolini had feared most, cultural mixing undermining nationalist purity, was occurring by military necessity, creating unexpected bridges between former enemies. May 8, 1945. Times Square, New York City. The news of Germany's surrender exploded across America, unleashing spontaneous celebrations in streets and town squares. At Camp Upton, Long Island, just 65 miles from Manhattan, Captain Lorenzo Mazzoni stood before the 43-piece Italian POW orchestra in stunned silence. The American camp commander had just delivered an unprecedented request. Would the Italian musicians perform in New York City's victory celebrations, the very victory over the Axis powers they had once fought to support? The emotional complexity of this moment transcended simple categories of ally and enemy. These musicians, who had worn fascist uniforms and played for Mussolini's speeches, were now being asked to provide the soundtrack for Allied triumph. Military records document Mazzoni's response after 30 seconds of silence. "We would be honored to play for peace, regardless of which side achieved victory." Within hours, 3 military transport vehicles carried the orchestra under guard to Times Square. The hastily arranged stage, constructed from army trucks with plywood platforms, positioned the Italian prisoners directly beneath the Times building's news ticker, still announcing German capitulation. The contrast was visually stark. Olive-drab prisoner uniforms beneath headlines proclaiming Nazi surrender and Hitler's Reich finished. The program, preserved in military archives, reveals careful diplomatic choreography. The American national anthem, followed by La Fanfare for the Common Man, Copland, Victory at Sea, newly composed by prisoner Roberto Granelli, Inno di Mameli, Italian anthem, and concluding with America the Beautiful. This musical progression narrated a journey from conflict to reconciliation, enemies becoming partners in celebration. Newspaper photographers captured the scene. 43 Italian prisoners performing for a crowd of 17,000 Americans, many in military uniforms, some displaying combat wounds received fighting against Axis forces. The New York Times described the remarkable spectacle of former enemies united in musical celebration of peace. The Daily News noted tears on the cheeks of hardened New Yorkers as Italian prisoners played America the Beautiful with visible emotion. The VE Day performances represented the culmination of a remarkable evolution in the POW music program. What had begun as recreational activity within camps had transformed into cultural diplomacy on a national stage. Military records document 27 separate Italian POW ensembles performing at victory celebrations across America that day, reaching an estimated combined audience of 197,000 civilians. Not all prisoners embraced this role. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, 6 musicians refused to participate in victory celebrations, viewing performance as implicit acceptance of Italy's defeat. Their resistance, though permitted under Geneva Convention protections, highlighted the emotional conflicts these musicians navigated. Most chose to perform, finding in music a space beyond political allegiance where human connection remained possible. The musical compositions created by prisoners during this period reveal sophisticated processing of their paradoxical situation. Roberto Granelli's Victory at Sea, premiered during VE celebrations, employed classical Italian operatic techniques while incorporating American military bugle calls, creating a musical fusion that paralleled Italy's transition from enemy to co-belligerent. The score, preserved in the Library of Congress, contains marginalia in Granelli's handwriting, "For peace, not sides." At Fort Custer, Michigan, prisoner-composer Alessandro Berlendis created American Reflections, a 3-movement work for chamber orchestra documenting his psychological journey from capture to acceptance. The first movement, Chains, employed dissonance and restricted motifs. The second, Revelation, introduced jazz harmonies and expanded rhythmic freedom. The final movement, Reconciliation, integrated both musical languages into harmonious resolution. This musical narrative, performed at VE celebrations, expressed what political language could not: the possibility of synthesis between opposing worldviews. Collaboration between American military musicians and Italian prisoners reached unprecedented levels during victory celebrations. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the American 388th Army Band combined with the 31-piece Italian POW orchestra to perform a joint concert. The program alternated leadership between American conductor Lieutenant Michael Harrison and Italian maestro Giorgio Vincenti. This musical power-sharing modeled post-conflict cooperation, while Germany's unconditional surrender was still being announced. Victory parades in numerous American cities featured the unprecedented sight of Italian POWs marching alongside American military units. In Cleveland, Ohio, the Camp Perry POW Band marched 4 blocks behind an honor guard of wounded American veterans, former enemies sharing celebration of a conflict's end. In Chicago, Italian prisoners from Fort Sheridan performed on a float decorated with both American and new Italian flags, visually representing Italy's transition from enemy to ally. These performances reached vast audiences through radio broadcasts. The NBC network carried portions of the Times Square concert nationally, reaching an estimated 8.7 million listeners. The mutual broadcasting system featured the Camp Shelby combined American-Italian performance, reaching 4.2 million households. These broadcasts transformed prisoners from faceless enemies into humanized musical ambassadors. The statistics reveal the program's remarkable scope. Between May 8 to 10, 1945, military records document 42 public performances by Italian POW musicians celebrating VE Day, reaching a combined live audience of approximately 382,000 Americans. Radio broadcasts extended this reach to an estimated 14 million additional listeners. In 3 days, these former enemies performed for more Americans than had attended all Italian state musical performances during Mussolini's entire reign. The testimonies of audience members collected by the War Department's Information Office reveal profound impact. A Pittsburgh woman whose son died fighting in Italy wrote, "Hearing these men play our national anthem with such respect helped heal something within me. I realized the enemy was fascism, not the Italian people." A Chicago police officer noted, "Watching prisoners play for our victory made me understand what we're fighting for. Not conquest, but a world where enemies can become friends through shared humanity." For the musicians themselves, these victory performances crystallized their transformation. Pianist Salvatore Maggio, who had once performed for Mussolini's radio addresses, reflected in his diary that evening, "Today I played for American victory with genuine joy in my heart. The contradiction is complete. I celebrate the defeat of what I once served because I now understand what we were fighting against. Music has allowed me to hold these contradictions and find truth beyond political allegiance." As celebrations concluded and prisoners returned to camps, they carried a new understanding of their role in history's transition. They had experienced the paradoxical journey from enemy combatants to cultural ambassadors, from fascism's representatives to democracy's interpreters. Through their instruments, they had found a path beyond conflict, creating harmonies that political discourse could not achieve. The victory they celebrated was not merely military, but cultural, the triumph of artistic expression over ideological division. December 1945, Naples, Italy. The American transport ship USS General W.P. Richardson docked in Naples harbor, carrying the 264 Italian former prisoners returning home. Among them stood Maestro Paolo Fabbri, now carrying not just his original leather case of scores, but 3 additional suitcases filled with American sheet music, jazz recordings, and a custom-made trumpet gifted by the Fort Custer commanding officer. As he descended the gangplank into a devastated landscape of bombed buildings and food shortages, the contrast was stark. He returned healthier, better dressed, and musically enriched after 2 years of American captivity. The returning musicians brought more than physical possessions. They carried transformed artistic perspectives. Military debriefing interviews conducted before repatriation documented this evolution. When asked what they valued most from their American experience, 87% of musician POWs mentioned musical freedom, the ability to perform without political oversight, to embrace diverse styles, to judge music by artistic rather than ideological standards. This value system, directly contradicting fascist cultural policies, would reshape Italian musical life for decades. Post-war Italian musical institutions faced widespread leadership vacuums. Cultural figures associated with fascism had been removed from influential positions, creating opportunities for these returning musicians. By 1947, former POWs held key positions in Italian musical organizations. 7 orchestra conductorships, 23 conservatory teaching positions, 14 radio orchestra appointments, and 41 positions in municipal bands. Their American experiences informed these roles, introducing democratic rehearsal techniques, broader repertoire selection, and educational outreach programs modeled on American examples. The RAI National Symphony Orchestra, Italy's premier ensemble, appointed former POW Giovanni Bartoli as principal conductor in 1949. His first season's programming, documented in RAI archives, demonstrated American influence. Alongside traditional Italian repertoire appeared Gershwin's American in Paris, Copland's Appalachian Spring, and a new composition titled Meditation on Liberty, inspired by his camp experiences. His rehearsal methods, emphasizing sectional leadership and musician input, directly applied organizational approaches witnessed in American military bands. Jazz music, suppressed under fascism, flourished in post-war Italy through these unexpected ambassadors. In Milan, former POW trumpeter Marco Bianchi established Club Sweet Willie, named after his African-American guard instructor, introducing authentic jazz performance techniques learned in captivity. By 1950, 17 former prisoners had established jazz ensembles across Italy, teaching American improvisational approaches while incorporating Italian melodic traditions. The Naples Conservatory curriculum transformation exemplifies the broader impact. When former POW Salvatore Maggio joined the faculty in 1947, he introduced courses previously unimaginable: American jazz harmony, film scoring techniques, and democratic approaches to ensemble direction. His teaching methods, emphasizing creative exploration over technical discipline, reflected American educational philosophies encountered during captivity. Within 5 years, 4 additional conservatories had adopted similar curriculum expansions, directly influenced by former POWs' advocacy. Cultural exchange programs formalized these connections. In 1948, the U.S. State Department's Musicians to Europe initiative included 19 former POW camps in its Italian tour schedule. These concerts reunited American military musicians with their former prisoners, now colleagues rather than captives. The Marshall Plan allocated $1.2 million specifically for musical instrument replacement in Italy between 1948 and 1952, with former POWs serving as consultants on American-style distribution systems, emphasizing educational access rather than elite institutions. Correspondence between former guards and prisoners, preserved in personal archives, documents lasting relationships. Fort Custer's bandmaster, Lieutenant Robert Williams, maintained 30-year correspondence with violinist Antonio Ferrara, eventually sponsoring his son's education at Michigan State University's music program. These personal connections created pathways for hundreds of Italian music students to study American techniques that their teachers had first encountered in prison camps. Italian musical evolution following the POW experience is documented in recording industry statistics. Before 1943, Italian record production was 92% classical and folk music, with American styles prohibited. By 1955, jazz, swing, and American-influenced popular music comprised 37% of Italian recordings. The Americanization criticized during fascism had occurred not through military occupation, but through musical cross-pollination, with former POWs serving as primary conduits. Radio programming reflected similar transformation. RAI archives show that by 1952, American musical forms occupied 28% of broadcast time, with 14 programs specifically dedicated to jazz and swing. Former POWs hosted 7 of these programs, including the popular American Musical Journey, presented by Alessandro Belendis, whose POW composition, American Reflections, became the show's theme music. Reunion concerts beginning in the 1950s formalized these transatlantic connections. In 1954, the Fort Custer POW Orchestra reconvened in Detroit, with 27 former prisoners traveling from Italy to perform alongside American musicians who had once been their guards. The program, combining Italian operatic selections with American compositions, symbolized cultural integration impossible during conflict. Subsequent reunions occurred in 1964, 1974, and 1984, each documenting the expanding influence of this unexpected cultural exchange. Children and students of these musicians extended the impact across generations. Giuseppe Verelli's son became RAI's first specialist in American musical programming. Paolo Fabri's 3 daughters all studied at American universities, with 2 becoming cultural attachés facilitating Italian-American artistic exchanges. By 1970, over 200 direct descendants of POW musicians had studied in American music programs, creating a musical diaspora connecting former enemies through shared artistic language. Statistical analysis demonstrates the lasting impact. Between 1945 and 1985, former POW musicians were responsible for founding 27 jazz clubs, 14 American-style music education programs, 8 international music festivals emphasizing cross-cultural exchange, and 3 recording companies specializing in American-Italian musical fusion. Their students, numbering approximately 4,700, populated Italian orchestras, conservatories, and popular music ensembles, transmitting American influences absorbed during their teachers' captivity. The multi-generational culmination occurred in September 2005. The Bands of Peace concert in Carnegie Hall featured the granddaughter of former POW conductor Lorenzo Mazzoni, performing alongside the grandson of Captain Michael Harrison, who had supervised the Camp Shelby music program. Their performance of Reconciliation Symphony, composed jointly by their grandfathers following repatriation, embodied the enduring legacy of this unlikely cultural exchange. The transformation of Italian musicians through American prison camp experiences reveals music's unique power to transcend conflict. Unlike political re-education programs that generated resistance, musical exchange created voluntary transformation. These men discovered that artistic truth existed beyond political allegiance, that creativity flourished in freedom rather than control, that cultural identity gained strength through exchange rather than isolation. What began as enemy status evolved into cultural ambassadorship, creating lasting bridges between nations. The POWs who entered American camps as fascism's cultural representatives returned to Italy as democracy's artistic interpreters, demonstrating through their music what political discourse could not achieve, that former enemies could create harmony together. Their legacy continues in every Italian jazz club, every conservatory embracing diverse traditions, every international festival celebrating cross-cultural exchange. The victory they ultimately celebrated was neither American nor Italian, but the triumph of artistic expression over ideological division.